Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan, His Life and Times by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 6, Foreign Minister to the Field Marshal, 1963 to 1965. The next morning, Zulfi called on India's philosopher president, Dr. S. Radhakrishnan, at Rashtrapati Bhavan. Radhakrishnan, who had lectured at Oxford, was a more polished orator than Bhutto. They talked about Kashmir and agreed that its early, honorable, and equitable resolution would open up many possibilities for economic and cultural cooperation between India and Pakistan to the mutual benefit of both nations. Having been born in South India, Radhakrishnan was hardly as emotionally committed to Kashmir as Nehru and other North Indian Brahmins, including Indira Gandhi. From the president's office, Zulfi went to Lok Sabha, where he met with the leading candidate to be chosen as Nehru's successor, Lal Bahadur Shastri, 1906 to 1966. Small and frail though he was, Shastri would soon prove himself as strong a leader of India's polity as Nehru had been, equally determined to retain Kashmir's valley as an integral part of India's union, even at the cost of war with Pakistan. Bhutto was to meet him again in Tashkent, but only after a year of diplomatic snipping that had erupted in two rounds of war between their countries. Had Zulfi underestimated Lal Bahadur's resolve in their first brief meeting? Shastri's diminutive stature and lack of polish and sophistication may have misled Zulfi to misjudge his adversary's tenacity. Acting Prime Minister Gulzari Lal Nandan received Foreign Minister Bhutto coldly in the Prime Minister's handsome office in South Block that Friday afternoon. As Nehru's Home Minister and the senior member of his cabinet, Nanda was in charge during the transitional morning interval. It soon became clear to observers that he hoped to remain in the office, which few Indians other than Nanda himself thought him fit to fill. Ascetic Hindu that he was, Nanda hardly found Bhutto's manner, appearance, or language congenial, never warming to this visitor. Nor did he say anything to give Zulfi reason to hope for an easy settlement of the Kashmir problem. Zulfi next went to see Congress President K. Kamaraj Nadar, the Tamil King of Love, who would soon become India's kingmaker, managing the succession of power first of Lal Bahadur Shastri and then of Indira Gandhi. Outmaneuvering their most powerful competitor, Morarji Desai, who was obliged to remain alone in his Gujarati stronghold in western India. Kamaraj was willing to listen to Bhutto, smiling sweetly at his flawless English, little of which Kamaraj understood and virtually none of which he spoke. Jaya Prakash Nanandyan, 1902 to 1979, though held no office at this or any other time during the remaining 15 years of his life, was one of India's leading socialists and a disciple of the saintly Vinoba Bhave, with whose tri-confederation solution for Indo-Pak differences in Kashmir, JP agreed. Narayan was to be the spiritual leader of the Janata, People's Movement, destined to topple Indira Gandhi's Congress government in the mid 1970s. JP, like Zulfi, had been educated in the West, had a cosmopolitan intellect open to winds of change and ideas from every continent. They talked cordially through the late afternoon and dined together in Zulfi's suite atop New Delhi's Ashok Hotel. Bhutto met with Indira Gandhi again on the morning of 30th May, returning briefly to Teen Murti House shortly before leaving Delhi. Sheikh Abdullah came to the airport to see him off, but too many other ears were there for them to have further private conversation. The early May Security Council meeting on Kashmir in New York had simply urged both parties to abstain from any act that might aggravate the situation in Kashmir. It was less than Bhutto had hoped for, but Sheikh Abdullah's release and Nehru's death before May ended gave Zulfi reason to hope for perhaps more movement towards a resolution of that premier South Asian problem, possibly along lines of Sheikh Abdullah's partition fallback plan. Yet, as June, with its sweltering heat, wore on in Karachi and Pindi, no change was seen in New Delhi's tough stand on Kashmir. Shastri was elected Prime Minister by his Congress party, thanks to Kamaraj's support. Soon after taking charge in Delhi, Shastri had suffered a minor heart attack, which made him seem even weaker. India's High Commissioner called on Foreign Minister Bhutto in Karachi near the end of June, using Shastri's illness as a reason for postponing talks or negotiations toward possible settlement of the Kashmir dispute during the July Commonwealth Conference scheduled to be held in London. Zulfi by now believed that no Indian leader was serious about reviving the plebiscite solution for Kashmir and suspected that Shastri would use his physical frailty as an excuse for further procrastination. By mid 1964, then, Zulfi made up his mind that the only solution was a military one. 17 years, he insisted, was long enough for Kashmir to wait for an impartial polling of its people. He had no doubt what the result of a plebiscite under UN auspices would be. No Pakistani did, nor did he believe that any shrewd leader in Delhi doubted the outcome. The crux of the matter was to arrange Kashmir's liberation without alarming Pakistan's Western allies enough that they would cut off vital material required to achieve it. In August of 1963, the United States had suspended a promised loan of more than $4 million for Dhaka airport when Pakistan signed its agreement on civil aviation with China. Throughout 1964, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk reaffirmed the importance of steadfast UN support to Indian economic development and defense efforts as a counter to China's growing strength and potential danger. India was viewed by Pentagon as the major counter to China in Asia, despite what that might mean toward undermining the US alliance with Pakistan. Ayub was preoccupied by mid 1964 with the most formidable political challenge to his power. In December 1963, he had taken on another presidency, that of the Pakistan Muslim League as well as of the nation. His constitutional program of basic democracies had promised national elections in 1964 to 1965. East Pakistan continued to seethe with antipathy to West Pakistani imperial domination. Suharwardi died suddenly, his heart failing in Beirut in September 1963, and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, 1922 to 1975, his leading lieutenant, vowed to avenge his leader's suspicious death, but was left first to try holding the Awami League together. Mujib was too young and unknown in the West himself to run against Ayub for presidency. A much older Bengali leader, former Governor General Khwaja Nazimuddin, then in the last year of his life, brilliantly brought together all the leaders of a broad spectrum of political opposition to Ayub, from right-wing Jamaat-e-Islami mullahs of the West to the left-wing Maulana Bhashani's National Awami Party of the East, from conservative council Muslim leaguers under the Northwest Frontier Province, Khan Abdul Qayyum Khan, 1901 to 1989, and the Nizam-e-Islami Party Old Guard under Chaudhry Muhammad Ali to the radical Awami League of Mujib himself. The combined opposition party, as they were called, found their ideal standard-bearer against Ayub Khan in Fatima Jinnah, 1893 to 1967, the gaunt, grey-haired, ascetic sister of the Qaid-e-Azam, who at the age of 71 took up the challenging burden of campaigning nationwide against the Field Marshal. Mother of the nation, Madre Millat, Fatima Jinnah was still a formidable presence. Her name alone won her widespread support. She tried to lure Zulfi Bhutto to her side, offering him the same job as he was then holding under Ayub if he joined her crusade. Zulfi, however, knew Ayub and West Pakistan's tough Punjabi chief minister, the Nawab of Kalam Bagh, too well to leave his secure perch at the foreign ministry to fly over to combined opposition parties' melange of wrangling outsiders. In the election, roughly two-thirds of the 80,000 enfranchised Basic Democrats did exactly as they were expected to do, reaffirmed their loyal faith in President Ayub Khan. That Miss Jinnah secured 36% of the votes, mostly from the East, was in itself a miraculous victory. She insisted ever after that she had, in fact, actually won that rigged election and should have become president of the land, of the pure her great leader brother had founded. Ayub and his cohort cheated her, she believed, though few Pakistanis in the West at any rate were in 1964 ready to be ruled by a woman. Now Miss Jinnah had nothing in common with the various opposition parties, yet she did not hesitate to come into the field, Ayub noted in his memoirs, typifying Pakistan's prevalent male chauvinism. Since the entire opposition campaign was to be based on emotionalism, her choice seemed logical. It was going to be emotionalism all the way, because she was, after all, an old lady and widely respected as sister of the Qaid-e-Azam. Zulfi helped Kalam Bagh stage the Lahore campaign at Mochi Gate, Pakistan's most crucial political testing ground. They had to be sure Ayub didn't fall flat on his face, for he was scarcely an orator. Kalambagh took care of arranging for the transport and sustenance of the civilian troops to that well-staged scene and suggested reading from the soul-stirring Urdu poetry of Allama Iqbal to keep the crowd in the good mood until the field marshal's arrival. Zulfi coached Ayub on how to speak, simplifying his political message to so huge an audience, teaching him to repeat the few most stirring phrases and important points, and how to avoid getting bogged down, as he usually did, with facts and figures, conceding no failure or fault, while slinging mud and dirt at the combined opposition party. Zulfi was passing on to Ayub his favorite tricks of rhetoric, all of which he would soon unleash in most virulent form against him. He also launched his uncle cousin Mumtaz's political career at this point. As foreign minister, Zulfi had no time to campaign in Larkana. He was in fact in New York for the Special Security Council meeting in May, when Mumtaz rang him up the day before Larkana nomination papers had to be filed to ask who should be the candidate from here. Mumtaz himself did not want to run. Zulfi replied, "You file the nomination papers, I am coming back shortly, and if you want to withdraw then, withdraw." Mumtaz filed and was elected unopposed. So then he came back and said, "Now why do you want to withdraw? Why should we lose the seat?" So I stayed. He knew he could rely on me. Everything seemed to be going Zulfi Bhutto's way that year. Almost everything. Husna had left her husband and moved to Karachi. Zulfi found a furnished house for her in Clifton, just a few minutes from his own larger place at number 70, a newer walled building off Sunset Boulevard, where they enjoyed watching popular videos late into the night, whenever they were not talking politics. Begum Nusrat had the children at home for the holidays, but both Benazir and Sanam, then aged 10 and 7, were at private English boarding school in Murree that year. Murtaza was 9 and at boarding school in Karachi. Only baby Shahnawaz, then just 6, remained at home. Nusrat knew well what her husband was doing and decided that she wanted no more of him. Ayub's warning and avuncular advice had wrought no change in Zulfi's heart or behavior. He was a bit more circumspect in his nocturnal meanderings for a while, but eventually Nusrat recalled, "I said I don't want to stay with him. I told him that I'll take 2 children and you keep 2 and I'll just go away." That was when she finally left him, flying home to her father and sisters in Iran, hoping to find peace there. But she could no longer pretend to be happily married to a man who never was at home, or worse still, who yelled at her and lied whenever he came within range. She tried to take Shah Nawaz with her, but Zulfi adamantly refused to let any of his children leave the country. He attempted forcefully to stop her from going as well, but soon recognized that she was determined to leave him. He knew that in many ways she was much stronger. The man in their family, as her father had once told him. So he had to let her fly, but not one of his children was permitted to leave the country with their mother. Nor would he let any of them write to her as long as she was outside Pakistan. For 6 months in Persian exile, Nusrat had nothing from any of her precious children. It was too high a price for her to bear. Begum Bhutto returned for her children and tried her best thereafter to pretend, I don't see Zulfi's nocturnal comings and goings. She was always the perfect hostess, of course, at official parties, which helped her somewhat to keep the pain and sorrow that weighed so heavily on her mind at bay. Some 8 years later, however, Nancy Kawasji recalled that Begum Nusrat attempted suicide by swallowing an overdose of barbiturates. Her husband's physician, Dr. Nasir Sheikh, reportedly averted the tragedy at Karachi's Parsi hospital. The fall of 1964, Pakistan and India had moved closer to war. On 24th September, Foreign Minister Bhutto endorsed a warning letter just received from the High Commissioner in New Delhi, alerting him to India's acquisition of powerful new arms. India is going way ahead, Bhutto told Ayub's secretariat. Her temporary difficulties should not deceive us. She is taking from both camps and ignoring protests in the wake. Shastri's defense minister, Y.B. Chavan, had proposed building up India's army to a well-equipped standard force of 825,000 men with 45 air squadrons and a navy that included submarines. Chavan had flown to Washington in May requesting F-124 fighter bombers of his Pentagon counterpart, Robert McNamara. Hindustan Aeronautics of Bangalore had just built and successfully tested two HF-24s, and Vice Premier Kosygin of the Soviet Union had offered to produce MiGs in India during his visit to Delhi for Nehru's funeral. But Pakistan's Air Force was armed with F-104s, giving Pindi an edge over India that Chavan was eager to remove. He was scheduled to meet President Lyndon Johnson on 28th May, but flew home for Nehru's funeral instead that morning in Secretary of State Dean Rusk's plane. At the end of August, Chavan flew to Moscow for a 2-week tour of the Soviet air and naval centers. He traveled in a submarine in the Gulf of Finland and met with General Malinovsky, then Minister of Defense, and Nikita Khrushchev just weeks before the latter was ousted by his Kremlin comrades. At the urging of the US Ambassador to India, Chester Bowles, President Johnson invited Prime Minister Shastri to Washington that fall. When Ayub learned of the invitation, he voiced so strong a personal complaint that Johnson backed down, pleading indisposition. Shastri was bitterly offended by that diplomatic slight but went to Canada as planned in October, refusing even to speak to Johnson when the White House called him in Ottawa, then accepting with alacrity an invitation from Kosygin to visit Moscow on his way home. Shastri stopped in Karachi on his return flight and met with Ayub on 12th October 1964 for a private and informal summit, their only meeting prior to Tashkent. By that time, there were daily incidents along the ceasefire line that separated Pakistan's Azad Kashmir from India's Jammu and Kashmir state. Shastri warned Ayub that there was danger that they might escalate into something bigger. India's diminutive Prime Minister told Pakistan's Marshal President that he would like to see the incidents in Kashmir stop. But Ayub countered that after 17 years of India's broken promises and hostile attitude towards Pakistan, there was an almost undeclared war going on. He complained about recent murders and violent evictions of a large number of Muslims from India's Assam and other eastern states, sparsely populated by the Naga and Mizo tribes, into which landless Bengali Muslims from the East Pakistan had migrated. Those peasants had cleared and cultivated jungle land in India, only to be terrorized now, butchered in their villages, or forced to flee for their lives. Shastri promised to look into that, expressing his willingness to meet with Ayub to discuss all such matters and iron them out. Then Ayub reverted to Kashmir, an even bigger problem. Shastri declared himself not strong enough to carry his people with him towards renegotiation of the Kashmir dispute at present. Ayub sent a note on the talk with Shastri to Foreign Minister Bhutto as well as to Foreign Secretary Aziz Ahmad. The Indians were obviously preparing for war and soon would have their own MiG factory assembling the USSR's most modern weapons. They might even get F 104s if Washington felt alarmed enough about losing India's friendship and non aligned support to its rival superpower. Time was therefore seen to be on the side of early action by Pakistan, as Zulfi Bhutto had been urging all the year. Ayub, moreover, would soon nave a fresh electoral mandate, his position as president secure for another 5 years. Ayub personally was convinced after seeing frail little Shastri that his Indian counterpart was too enfeebled to respond with more than a whimper to any frontal assault or outright war. Shastri had turned over his Ministry of External Affairs portfolio to Swaran Singh by this time, and Bhutto's contemptuous mimicry of the white-bearded Sikh with whom he had long argued over Kashmir was well known to Ayub. On Zulfi's recent visit to Jakarta, President Sukarno promised him Indonesian naval support for Pakistan in any war against India, even as China had promised military support. Chavan appealed to Great Britain for military aid, but the best the British would do for India was to provide naval assistance under the cover of a joint US-UK naval presence in the Indian Ocean in support of Malaysia. India's policy of non-alignment still paid off, however, helping New Delhi secure military muscle from the West as well as from the Soviets. Washington was alarmed to find the Foreign Minister Bhutto flirting so ardently with Indonesia and China and no longer felt fully confident of Pakistan's most allied status. All eyes in South Asia were focused on Jammu and Kashmir. But the first round of fighting erupted at much lower altitudes early in April 1965. The Rann salt marsh of Kutch, the often submerged lower borderland between Sindh and Gujarat, hardly seemed worth fighting over. Pakistan's long-standing claim to the northern half of the Rann, covering over 3,500 square miles, had continued to be disputed by Indian policymakers from Nehru to Swaran Singh. In March 1964, Pakistan had established 2 police posts in Rann of Kutch, which India soon asserted were well inside India's border and hence countered with an armed post of its own. A warning was issued by Indian Home Minister Nanda in Lok Sabha on 7th April that New Delhi would take effective measures to remove intrusions. The next day, an Indian note to Pakistan's Foreign Office protested a massive concentration of Pakistani arms on the border closest to the new outposts. US pattern tanks had been moved into position. The Indians had nothing better than distant centurions with which to confront them. At 3 a.m. on 9th April 1965, Pakistan's infantry advanced towards India's Sardar post in the Rann. Firing ensued. India accused Pakistan of aggressively initiating the shooting. Pakistan insisted its patrols were moving peacefully between Ding and Surai when entrenched Indian forces opened fire against them. Each side thus accused the other of starting the conflict that immediately drew blood. Skirmishes continued between the border patrols for 2 weeks, and on 25th April, Deputy High Commissioner P. N. Kaul was called to the Foreign Office in Karachi and warned that aggressive Indian intrusions into Pakistani territory would be met by force. In New Delhi, the conflict was described as almost a state of war. Pakistan now had 96 Patton tanks at the front, and India claimed, Pakistan denied, that 30 of them advanced on the morning of 26th April to take the Indian post of BR Bet. Each side declared it had inflicted heavy casualties on the other. One Pakistani general exulted, "We gave them hell." Zulfi Bhutto was in sin at this time. Though he made no loud or boastful proclamations, he agreed with the consensus of foreign observers that Pakistan had soundly beaten India in the Minian War, a softening up prelude to the real thing. On 1st May 1965, Ayub informed Pakistan in a broadcast to the nation that India's attack was foiled in Kutch and our forces were in the disputed Rann to stay at least until monsoon floods would drive all patrols from the region. Indian naval units moved into range of the Rann, however, and by late July, some 20,000 Indian troops were marshaled just beyond the Rann's waterline, poised to move into position inside the salt marsh as soon as the monsoon ended. Immediately after the Kutch incident, General Gul Hassan, then the director of Pakistan's military operations, met with General Ayub Khan in his office. Ayub took me along to brief Bhutto and Aziz Ahmad, foreign secretary at that time. So Ayub asked me, "Do you think India will attack?" I said, frankly, no. They had chosen Kutch way out on a limb, thinking they could get a bit of territory. But we responded, and now both armies were in place. At the same time, we were planning to send these mujahids across the border in Kashmir. A cell was constituted on Ayub's order, and Aziz Ahmad was a member of that cell. Pakistan's Kashmir infiltration was codenamed Operation Gibraltar. Armed commandos were trained in the hills to cross the ceasefire line from Pakistan and Azad Kashmir to stir uprisings in Kashmir Vale. The uprisings, it was assumed, would trigger Indian responses inside Kashmir, which would in turn stimulate local Kashmiri Muslims to fight for freedom. Once the monsoon ended and the pot was briskly boiling round Srinagar, Pakistani troops could move in swiftly to liberate the Vale in the next operation, codenamed Grand Slam. It all seemed perfectly simple that May, though General Gul Hassan had reservations, cautioning his more gung-ho colleagues in Pindi's general headquarters. "Look here, we are sending in all these guerrillas. We'll escalate." Sheikh Abdullah had been touring abroad, openly stating in London that if a plebiscite were fairly held, the result would be Kashmir's accession to Pakistan. Upon his return to New Delhi in May 1965, the Lion of Kashmir was arrested and flown to South India for detention, rather than being permitted to fly north to Srinagar, where New Delhi's leaders feared he would have been received as a popular hero. He remained, stirring demands for Kashmiri freedom. As tension escalated in Kutch, Patton tanks were being moved to the border despite Washington's insistence that such equipment was never to be used against India. President Johnson abruptly cancelled a scheduled meeting with Ayub in April 1965. Bhutto immediately informed the ambassador of the Soviet Union that Ayub would be happy to visit Moscow instead of Washington in early April. Premier Kosygin jumped at the diplomatic opportunity, arranging the first Soviet-Pakistani summit on remarkably short notice. Bhutto, during the Kremlin launching of the oil and gas exploration venture, had established cordial personal relations with Nikita Khrushchev. But Ayub's visit was a major turning point in Pakistan's international position, making it clear that India would no longer be the sole South Asian power to take arms from both the East and the West. Within 3 years of Ayub's visit, Soviet military equipment started to flow into Pakistani cantonments. Of more immediate importance, however, was the joint statement issued at the end of that brief summit, in which Soviet support of those fighting for their self determination was affirmed, a clear reference to Kashmir.